Hi, it's been a while. I'm sorry about the upload schedule going out the window, but don't worry, I haven't quit YouTube and I'm hoping to get some sort of balance back where I can keep uploading to this channel. Anyway, let's continue with the How to Play Warhammer 40k mini-series. So, welcome back to the second part of the mini-series on How to Play Warhammer 40k 9th edition. If you missed the first part of this series on getting started and building an army, there should be a tag in the top right as well as a link in the description to that video. In this video, we'll be covering terrain, missions, and deployment. If you want to catch the rest of this series as it comes out, then the best way is to subscribe to this channel. Anyway, enough shilling, let's start with terrain. So 9th edition expanded terrain rules significantly over previous editions by giving specific rules to different kinds of terrain. Now don't worry, you shouldn't need to remember a million different rules for every different kind of terrain piece on your board. They boil down to some pretty easy to remember rules. In this part, I'll go over the rules for the different pieces of terrain, and then I'll give an example board setup. Firstly, terrain is broken down into 4 different styles: hills, obstacles, area, and buildings. Hills are just part of your board and don't interfere with models in any interesting way. The only way it can act as cover is if the hill is big enough to hide models behind it. Obstacles can be moved on as if they were a normal part of the terrain, unless there are rules that say otherwise, and only a model that is completely hidden by the obstacle cannot be fired at. Obstacles provide the benefits of cover to infantry, beasts and swarms whilst they're within 3 inches of the terrain piece, unless the units attacking are closer to the units they're targeting than the terrain piece. The rules do go into a bit more detail, seeing you need to see all parts of the base without going through the obstacle, but it's just a bit verbose so you can't misinterpret the rules. Next is area terrain, which you can move through while still getting the benefits of the cover effects. Infantry, beasts and swarms all benefit from cover whilst within area terrain. You will have to agree with your opponent as to what does and what doesn't count as within the area terrain, although most of the terrain will be pretty obvious what is and isn't within it. Finally, there are buildings. Buildings pretty much only refers to specific fortifications that you can find in the codexes and in chapter approved. There are no cover rules except when a unit is completely obscured by the building. Buildings are considered units and therefore cannot be walked across and can be attacked, though there are quite a few terrain pieces that have no wounds characteristic and are therefore invincible, so attacking them is kind of pointless. Unfortunately, that's not all when it comes to terrain. There are also rules for each piece of terrain that defines what receives the benefit of cover means. So, there are 12 rules that apply to terrain. I'm going to order them from what should be the most abundant on your board to what should be the scarcest. I will add any caveats that come with the rules, what type of terrain you'll typically find has this rule, and specific terrain pieces that will carry the rule. Obscuring is the most important kind of terrain in any Warhammer game. Breaking up sightlines means that armies have to be mobile and can't just sit at the back of the board and pick off your opponent's entire army. It also means that heavy weapon teams need to reposition to be able to consistently shoot things. Anyway, obscuring terrain is different to just having a unit being obscured. You can have a unit be completely unseen due to a large piece of terrain or a unit in the way. However, an obscuring terrain piece, that means that even if you can see a leg or something from the unit behind the terrain piece, it counts as being completely obscured. This rule does not apply to aircraft or models with 18 or more wounds. You can still target units that are within or on top of an obscuring piece of terrain, so bear that in mind. Oh, also, the terrain piece needs to be at least 5 inches tall for some reason. Obscuring terrain tends to be area terrain, with most common pieces being ruins or other buildings with small windows or battle damage in them. Now technically you don't need most of the terrain piece on your board to have the obscuring rule, just make sure that the terrain blocks line of sight. Alright, now for the terrain rule you'll probably see the impact of the most: light cover. Light cover simply adds 1 to regular saving throws of units within or behind the piece of terrain if they are being attacked by a ranged weapon. Pretty simple stuff. This is what cover meant in 8th edition. Light terrain can be found in both area and obstacle terrain pieces. Examples of light terrain are barricades, crates, craters, and ruined buildings and walls. It begins to get muddled as to what the next most common piece of terrain should be, so I'd suggest having breachable terrain as the next most common piece of terrain. This just means that infantry, beasts and swarms can move through walls and like of the terrain piece without any impediment. Breachable terrain comes in both area and obstacle form, with common examples being ruins, barricades and small walls. This allows your infantry to be more mobile and makes the game generally more movement focused. Next is scalable terrain. Scalable means that if a unit has the keywords infantry, swarm, beast or fly, they can end their movement on top of a terrain piece. Furthermore, infantry, swarms and beasts can move through ceilings and walls in a similar fashion to the breachable rule. Scalable terrain is often area terrain, with the most common being industrial structures, ruins, and other buildings with multiple stories. The opposite of scalable is unstable position. This prevents any units from finishing their moves on top of the terrain piece. Pretty much all unstable position terrain comes in the form of obstacle terrain like barricades and ruined walls. Defensible is one of the more common rules as listed in the rulebook, but it's one of the more complicated and situational ones. If an infantry unit is within or behind the piece of terrain with a defensible rule, it can either overwatch on a 5+, or get +1 to hit in the subsequent fight phase. You only have to declare the choice you've made once you've been targeted for a charge. I'll go into more detail about what this means in the next video. Note this rule only activates when you are being charged by a unit outside of the terrain piece. Defensible terrain comes in both area and obstacle form, with examples being barricades, ruins, small walls, or even woods. Defense line is next. It makes the units behind the terrain piece able to be charged as long as they are within an inch of the terrain piece. And it makes it so that only units within 2 inches of the enemy units are eligible to fight. So bear that in mind when fighting over defense line pieces of terrain. Defense lines are pretty much always obstacles, but you could make an excuse for it being an area piece of terrain. Examples of defense lines are barricades and ruined walls. Exposed position is thankfully a very simple rule. If you are on top of the piece of terrain, you don't get the benefit of cover. This is because there typically isn't anything that would be providing cover on top of the terrain piece. It usually comes in the form of obstacles, with crates and large debris being good examples. These last few rules should probably be pretty uncommon on your board, as they either give a significant buff or debuff, or are not applicable to most of the terrain pieces. Firstly, heavy cover. This gives +1 to a normal saving throw in the fight phase if you did not charge in the previous charge phase. Pretty simple stuff, but very punishing for melee armies that need to charge. This usually comes in obstacle form with terrain like barricades. Next up is dense cover. Dense cover has one of the longest rules sections, which can be boiled down to, if you're inside this terrain piece, anyone shooting you outside that terrain piece suffers a -1 to hit. The terrain needs to be 3 inches tall for whatever reason, and aircraft and units with over 18 wounds don't get the -1 to hit. Not too complicated, just don't put too much down because -1 to hit is pretty infuriating for quite a few armies. Dense cover is nearly always area terrain, with examples being woodlands and complicated industrial structures. Our penultimate terrain rule is difficult ground. This slows your movement by 2 inches if you move over this terrain piece, moving including charging in this case, although advancing doesn't actually get weakened. The only units that don't get affected by this are units with the fly keyword. I'll generally avoid using this terrain piece outside of plonking a crate or 2 down on an objective. It just slows the game down and makes it unfun with somebody trying to maneuver around the board, particularly if you get something like Terminators caught in there and they have their movement cut in half. All difficult ground terrain is area terrain, with examples being craters and maybe woodlands. Final terrain rule. So the last piece of terrain is inspiring, which gives +1 to the leadership of units within 6 inches. This would be okay as a minor objective to contest, but it could only apply to units with a keyword that is appropriate for the building. For example, a statue of Grueman would only buff Ultramarines, or maybe Imperium models in general if you're feeling generous. I'd save these terrain pieces for narrative games only. All inspiring terrain pieces should be obstacles, with an example being the Imperial statuary. Okay. That is a lot to digest, so I'm going to create an example board to show what a fair and balanced board should look like. Then I'm going to go over the rules that each terrain piece on the board has and explain why I put things where they were. Right, let's go over this. The main key feature of any Warhammer terrain is having tall, line-of-sight blocking buildings. As such, this board has 10 pieces dotted around the board. This may be a little excessive for your board, playstyle, or terrain, so you can rearrange the pieces, combine multiple buildings together, or have more interesting designs. You could even cut down the number of terrain pieces if you're playing at a smaller point value than 2000. The only advantage to having these L-shaped buildings is they're easy to identify what is and isn't out of line of sight, and what does and doesn't count as terrain. I would advise against having large square buildings or large rectangular buildings, as they are hard to traverse around and generally don't provide a ton of interesting gameplay. Small square buildings that you can easily climb over, however, are usually okay. As for other pieces of terrain, putting some craters and difficult pieces of terrain in the centre of the map can slow down melee armies and provide some decent cover in the alleyways between the large terrain pieces. Furthermore, placing down some barricades with light and heavy cover can be good for holding the line. Whether you think placing these near objectives will lead to too much turtling or not is entirely up to you and who you're playing with. To fill out a few more areas, you can place down some crates and large containers to break up line of sight, or just add a little bit of light cover. Finally, to make your board a bit more thematic, you can put some rubble and other pieces of terrain just so the board looks pretty. You probably don't need to give these terrain pieces rules though, although if you do, difficult scalable terrain will probably be the best fits. You can, of course, play outside of a normal city's landscape. With a more natural landscape, you can use large rocks and hills to replace the large line of sight blocking terrain. You can use trees to replace the craters and barricade, and generally some other features such as tall grass and brushland for extra pieces of terrain. Generally though, 40k favours buildings and other large pieces of terrain, both because that's what Games Workshop sells the most of, and because 40k is a sci-fi setting, so you'd expect it to be in a sci-fi location. The terrain I recommended in the last video is pretty much all blocking, light, scalable and defensible position terrain, so it's a good place to get started. Oh my, we really are far into this video and haven't even discussed the other main issues in this video. Let's do deployment really quickly. Deployment works much like how it did at the start of 8th. For matched play games, you need to first select a mission. I'll be going into a bit more detail how the missions work just after this section. Once you have a mission selected, both you and your opponent need to roll to decide who is the attacker and who is the defender. The person who rolls higher will get to decide who's who. Whoever gets the role of defender gets to choose which deployment zone to use as described by the mission. The attacker takes the other zone. Then, you and your opponent take turns to deploy units, starting with the attacker. Once both you and your opponent have fully deployed your armies, both players roll a dice, and whoever rolls higher gets to go first. Once that is done, you are ready to play. But of course, before you deploy your armies, you need to choose a mission. They come in 3 varieties: open, narrative, and matched, but the gist of them mostly is the same. They determine your deployment zone, the location of objectives, any bonus rules that come with a mission, and a secondary objective. On top of the main objectives that come with each mission, there are side objectives you can choose before the start of the game which determine what you do to score points. Main objectives in match play almost always boil down to hold 2, hold 3, and hold more than your opponent. There are some exceptions where hold 2 and hold 3 are replaced with hold 1 and hold 2, especially in smaller game sizes. Each of these can score you 5 points per turn for a total of 15 points per turn. You cannot score any of these main objective points on the first turn, because everyone would start with the default 5 points, as there is at least one objective inside every deployment zone. Now there are variations on these 3 default main mission objectives, so make sure both you and your opponent read the mission before playing. Now secondary objectives are a lot more interesting. In match play games, both you and your opponent can choose up to 3 secondary objectives, secretly, after setting up the terrain features, but before deployment. Only reveal what your secondary objectives are once both you and your opponent have chosen and you are ready to reveal them. Clearly mark them in some way to say what secondary objectives you are choosing, so you can't change your mind as you reveal them. You choose your 3 secondary objectives from 6 different categories. You can only choose a maximum of 1 secondary objective from each category. Additionally, you can only score a maximum of 15 points from each secondary objective, leading to a total of 45 points available from secondary objectives across the entire game. So, what is each category and what is in them? Firstly, there is Purge the Enemy. This is your simple kill objectives. They start with Assassinate, which scores you 3 points for every character model you kill. Pick this one if your opponent has 3 or more character models you could reasonably kill. Next is Bring It Down, which scores you 2 points for every vehicle and monster you kill. Unless it has 11 wounds or more, then it gives you 3 points instead. Choose this one if your opponent is running 6 or 7 small vehicles, 5 large vehicles, or a mix of the two. Next up is Titan Slayers, which gives you 10 points for killing 1 Titanic model, or 15 points for killing more than one. Pick this one if you're an army capable of killing knights or chaos knights, and you're in that matchup. There really isn't another matchup I can think of where this is all too relevant. Maybe in a matchup against Chaos where they're running multiple Khorne Lord of Skulls. Finally, there is Slay the Warlord, which will score you 6 points if the enemy warlord is destroyed. This is a surprisingly low value objective, so only pick this one if there's no way you could kill 3 or more characters. Next is No Mercy, No Respite. This is also mostly kill objectives. They start with Thin Their Ranks, which gives you a 10th of a point for every model you destroy. This means killing melee, psychic, shooting, or morale. If the model has 10 or more wounds, you get a whole point instead. You generally want to pick this against hordes, or against an army that has a lot of models with 10 or more wounds. Still though, Bring It Down and Titan Slayers gives you more points for the larger models, so you probably want to be choosing that over this. Attrition scores you 4 points if you kill more enemy units than your opponent kills at the end of each battle round. This is a good objective if your opponent is fielding a lot of units in small sizes. You need to score it 4 out of the 5 battle rounds to make good value out of it. You can also make good use out of this objective if you are running a very elite low unit count army. Next up is While We Stand We Fight, which gives you 5 points for each of the 3 most expensive units in your army that survive until the end of the game. War gear is taken into account when calculating the expense. Choose this one if you have some very survivable high value characters, like Space Marine captains. Choosing 3 of them in a vehicle heavy army can be very risky, as there's lots of ways for people to bring anti-tank in this edition. Finally, there is First Strike, which scores you 5 points if you kill something in the first battle round, and additional 3 points if you kill more than your opponent. At only 8 points, this one is moderate value. Only choose this one if you don't feel like you can accomplish any of the other objectives. Next is Battlefield Supremacy. This one is all about board control. They are Engage on All Fronts, which scores you 2 points at the end of your turn if a unit is wholly within 3 of the 4 table quarters and is more than 6 inches from the centre. You score 3 instead if you can get units wholly within every quarter of the table. Choose this one if you have a fast army and you can get into your opponent's deployment zone in turn 1. The longer you stay there, the better. Linebreaker is next, which scores you 4 points for every turn you end with 2 or more units in your enemy's deployment zone. This is good in 2 situations. 1, where you charge into your opponent's deployment zone and stay there the whole game, or 2, where your opponent charges you and you can throw down some units from deep strike in their backline, which sit there in the deployment zone and rack up points. Next is Domination, which scores you 3 points if you control more than half of the objective markers. This one is pretty generic, and on boards with a low number of objectives it's pretty low value, but if you have, say, 6 objectives, it can be somewhat accomplished if you can keep board control for most of the game. Note you will have to score it every single turn in order to make the maximum amount of value out of it. Next up is Shadow Operations. These objectives require you to do actions. Actions prevent you from shooting, moving, fighting, or casting psychic powers. You also cannot advance or fall back and perform any other action. Typically, they start at the end of your movement phases. The objectives are Investigate Site, which scores you 3 points if you perform the action with a non-character infantry unit that is within 6 inches of the centre of the battlefield, while your opponent has no units within 6 inches of the centre of the battlefield. You complete the action and thus score the points at the end of your turn. Repair Teleport Homer gives you 5 points when you complete the action with a non-character infantry unit. The action can only be performed whilst wholly within the enemy's deployment zone and finishes at the end of your next command phase, assuming the unit is still alive and has not been interrupted. Finally, there's Raise the Banners High. For this action, you need to be controlling an objective at the end of your movement phase. You can use the action to raise a banner on that objective marker with an infantry unit. It does not have to be a non-character unit, which is quite nice. The action ends at the end of your turn. Once you have raised a banner, you score 1 point at the end of your command phase for each banner you have raised. You can raise multiple banners per turn. The banner remains raised until your opponent holds the objective. Presumably they just walk up and just knock it over. Now we're looking at Warpcraft. These are your psychic based objectives. They are Mental Interrogation. In your psychic phase, your psychic can, instead of manifesting any powers, use this action within 18 inches of any character to mentally interrogate the character. Every time you perform this action, you score 3 points. These psychic actions have to be cast in a similar way to how normal psychic powers works, and can be denied in the same way as a normal psychic power. Psychic actions only prevent you from casting any other psychic powers this turn. It doesn't actually prevent you from performing any other actions, so you can still charge your psychics into melee afterwards. The warp charge of this action is 4, that means you have to match or beat a 4 on 2d6. Remember, you will also suffer perils of the warp as normal, so double 6s and double 1s are wanted to be avoided. I will be covering more about psychic powers in the next video though. So, we'll move on to the next objective, which is Psychic Ritual. It allows you to perform a psychic action with a warp charge of only 3, whilst within 6 inches of the centre of the battlefield. If you perform the action 3 times, then you gain 15 points. The wording isn't 100% clear on whether one unit in particular has to perform the action 3 times, or multiple units can contribute to the end goal, but I'd favour the latter personally. Finally, there's Abhor the Witch. If no psychers are in your army, you can select this objective. It gives you 5 points for every psychic character you kill, and 3 for every non-character psyker you kill. Pretty easy stuff. So, that leaves us with the final category, the mission-specific secondary objectives. I'm not going to go through all of these because there is quite a lot of them, but always remember to consider them when choosing your secondary objectives. I would keep about 4 missions your army is designed to accomplish, and then rotate between them depending on the matchup, and always consider the mission specific one as well. I'm going to add on the end here, the aircraft, that is, actual aeroplanes and other large flying vehicles with a minimum move characteristic, cannot perform actions and do not contribute towards denying or controlling objectives. They also do not contribute to the secondary or primary objectives that require you to be in certain areas of the board. The one exception to this rule is engage on all fronts. They can also contribute towards kill objectives, which makes them not entirely useless for objective-based play. Right, that should be everything you need to know about missions, deployment, and terrain. Once again, I'm going to apologise for my garbage upload schedule. I'll try to look towards getting more consistency in the future, but it might be a couple of months before that happens. I am looking to get my hands on the Necron and Space Marine codexes as soon as possible, so I'll be returning to my old format as soon as possible. This is just a small video mini-series to tide you over till then. It should only be a couple more videos until the series is finished, but if you enjoyed this video, feel free to leave a like, and if you would like to see more content like this, then obviously subscribing is the best thing to do. I'm very grateful for all the support this channel has gotten. Lastly, I'd like to thank you all very much for watching.